in this meeting, our panel of speakers in the room and online will address the topic of Labour, Palestine and Islamophobia. We are now almost 12 months into Israel's genocidal assault on the Palestinian people in the Gaza Strip. More than 41,000 Palestinians have already been killed by Israel. Horror at Israel's genocidal violence and outrage at Britain's continued complicity, both in these attacks and in the decades-old illegal occupation and imposition of a system of oppression amounting to apartheid, have produced one of the largest and most sustained political protest movements in the history of this country. Dominating the agenda at the international courts, on the streets of cities around the world, and at the United Nations, the struggle for Palestinian rights is one of the biggest issues in global politics today. But it's also a huge issue for Labour. At the general election in July, the return of a large parliamentary Labour majority was tainted by a collapse in support amongst many of our previously most loyal voters. The leadership's stance on Gaza, which initially at least included the suggestion that Israel had the right to use starvation as a weapon of war through the cutting off of food, fuel, water and medical supplies, produced deep alienation, especially within some minority communities. In constituencies with a Muslim population of 10% or more, the Labour vote fell by an average of 11 points, resulting in depleted majorities at best, and even the loss of formerly safe seats to candidates who made support for Palestinian rights a central element of their programme. Perhaps most alarmingly of all, attempts that we have witnessed throughout the year to stigmatise the solidarity movement, including, I'm sorry to say, by some within the Labour Party, helped to fuel the racist and Islamophobic violence of the far right this summer. Repairing this damage and addressing these issues then is not just a moral imperative for the Labour Party, although it most certainly is that. It could also prove vital to our future electoral prospects. And it's these questions that our panel are going to speak to this lunchtime. So I'm very pleased to be able to introduce our panel. Liz Fekete of the Institute of Race Relations, Samayya Afzal from the Labour Muslim Network. On the screen here, journalist and historian Taj Ali, who can't be with us in person, but as I say, joining us on the screen, and Ben Jamal, the director of the Palestine Solidarity Campaign. So I'm going to ask the speakers to speak in that order, and then I'm going to hopefully open it up for questions and points from the floor. So if I can ask Liz to speak first. Thank you.
I'm feeling a bit boxed in there, and it's my first Labour Party conference, and I don't want to feel boxed in. I want to be able to feel that I can speak to you freely today. And I've been asked to speak about the role that anti-Palestinian racism and Islamophobia have played in the rise of far right. And I want to say from the start that they say that honesty is the best policy. And though it might not make me popular here today, I want to make my contribution to the panel as clear and direct as possible, because this is a subject in which we do need to be clear and direct. So from the point of view of the organisation, which I'm the head of, the Institute of Race Relations, which is an anti-race resource centre and an educational charity, I have to say, from the point of view of the IRR and the communities and organisations we serve, there is now a lack of belief that the Labour Party leadership and the Labour Party machinery share our core anti-racist, anti-fascist and international values. There is a lack of belief that they have any understanding of a systemic racism that moves beyond issues of prejudice or bias, preferably unconscious bias. Having said that, my points are not directed to the Labour movement or the Labour Party membership, much of which I think share those values. And those values coalesce around an understanding, an informed understanding of how modern electoral, racist and far-right parties operate globally. And within the far-right pole of global electoral parties across the world, support for Israel as the epicenter of the fight to defend the West from Muslim hordes is central to the far right today. That is what is unique to the modern period. We can't go back to the 1930s. We have to study the far right today. I think it's no exaggeration to say that in the last 15 years, which has seen the far-right electoral parties become king and queen makers in European policies, I think it's no exaggeration to say that this seems to have passed the Labour leadership by. At the very bare minimum, the leadership needs to educate itself about conspiracy theories about Muslims and the hold these conspiracy theories have in popular culture, not least because of the foxification of British news. I'm not just talking about GB News and Talk TV, I'm talking about what's happening at the BBC. And then, of course, there is a failure to call out genocide. Genocide is the highest form of racism. If you issue edicts in your brochures or whatever, which says that you can't mention genocide, you're also basically saying that you can't mention racism. Internationally, genocide, whether of the Jews or the Roma in Nazi Germany, Bosnians at Srebrenica, the Rohingya in Myanmar, or Palestinians in Gaza, is always justified. Genocide is always justified by the demonisation of those targeted who are held to have mass characteristics compared to animals and insects in order to eliminate them. Those who fail to speak out against genocide normalise murderous racism. And those who see nothing wrong with working with extreme right electoral parties in Italy and France, which are the very threat to the very existence of Muslims and migrants, are also guilty of normalising racism. The argument that we hear now from the Labour Party leader as he visits Italy and indicates that he would work with Marine Le Pen on channel crossings is that British pragmatism defines our relationship with far-right electoral parties. Given that Starmer refused to condemn Farage's conspiratorial thinking about the perpetrator of the Southport killings, we must presume now that Labour's relationship with Reform UK will also be based on pragmatism. Forgive me if I'm being cynical or perhaps a little sarcastic, but all this reminds me of the oft-repeated phrase that under Mussolini, at least the trains ran on time. Only now we seem to be replacing trains and timetables under Mussolini with stopping the boats and smashing the gangs in cooperation with Marine and Maloney. When it comes to Islamophobia and anti-Palestinian racism, the two interact but are not the same. The Labour Party has done much as any other party in normalising these two pernicious forms of racism. Well, now, as you can tell by looking at me, I am no longer a spring chicken. I've been around for a long time in the anti-racist and anti-fascist movement. And I remember when 69 young left-wing people were gunned down one by one by the murderous Islamophobe Anders Breivik at a Norwegian Labour Party summer camp in 2011. Breivik said that his act of mass murder was necessary to wipe out the next generation of Labour Party leaders who would bring about mass immigration of Muslims to Europe. He was an ardent supporter of Israel, and he, like the counter-jihadi and Stop Islam movements emerging at the time, including the English Defence League, put Israel on a pedestal due to the civilisational vigour it showed to Palestinians. I believe the Labour Party has let itself down by not remembering those young people who were murdered. It makes me very sad. And we have to recognise that across Europe today, far-right activists are applauding Israel's genocidal campaign, just as they applauded and participated in some cases in the massacre of Bosnian Muslims at Srebrenica. Let me look more closely at what's happened in the UK during the last months. During pro-Palestine student protests last summer, it became clear that far-right activists from Patriots of Britain and Turning Point UK, as well as Tommy Robinson's foot soldiers, were joining forces with pro-Israel groups to harass and racially abuse pro-Palestinian students on campus. On Armistice Days last year, a far-right mob went on the rampage at the Cenotaph. On WhatsApp groups, they called for their supporters to bring high-caliber crowbars. They helpfully provided links where to buy them. They made plain that their purpose was to violently attack the Palestinian Solidarity March. So just as the murder of young socialists by Breivik was an act of Islamophobia, it was also an act of political violence. It was an act of targeted political violence by a far-right figure against the left. So too has been the political violence targeted at the Palestinian Solidarity movement by the far right. This should have been a wake-up call to Labour, but it wasn't. And yet, even after the orchestrated far-right racist violence this summer, targeted at asylum seekers as well as British Muslims and their religious centre, the Labour leadership has not sent an unequivocal message to the country that Islamophobia and anti-Palestinian racism will not be tolerated. Instead, the Prime Minister has changed the subject from combating fascism to combating violent thuggery across the ideological spectrum, even as one of the party's advisers, Lord Warney, continues his reckless and partisan attacks on pro-Palestinian activists. I said before that Islamophobia and anti-Palestinian racism interact, but there are differences between the two forms of racism. Anti-Palestinian racism is a form of anti-Arab racism that aims to silence, exclude, erase, stereotype or defame Palestinians and their narratives. It coalesces around exclusion and punishment of anything visibly Palestinian. Let me conclude with a few suggestions as to how I think the Labour Party leadership and machinery could address its normalisation of anti-Palestinian racism. As a first step, I think it needs to end its reliance on the widely discredited International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance working definition of anti-Semitism, which allows for the conflation of anti-Semitism with anti-Zionism. Even one of the drafters of that working definition has said that it has been weaponised for uses other than the fight against anti-Semitism. The IHA definition works to deny Palestinians the right to name and resist their oppression and is being used as an instrument of anti-Palestinian racism. I think that the Labour Party should make reparations for the callous treatment of Dalal Nedar, who lost five members of his family in the siege of Gaza and was ejected from a Labour Party fundraiser as he attempted to draw attention to his suffering and the wider suffering of Palestinians. I don't know whether people here saw that ejection. It was widely circulated on social media. Personally, when I saw it, I found it abhorrent, and it brought great shame to the party. Stop mainstreaming Islamophobia and anti-Palestinian racism, not least by ending relationships with government advisers such as Lord Warney, John Woodcock, whose partisan approach and repeated unsubstantiated claims against aggressive Palestinian activists should mean that he has no place as an advisor to a Labour government. Finally, recognise that the British Palestinian community is a diasporic community that we owe a special debt to, given that it is our colonial history and our arms industry and our strategic post-war interests in the Middle East that has helped create this diaspora. Let's commit ourselves to stand up for the free expression rights of the British Palestinian community and Palestinian students and refugees resident in the UK. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Liz, for those excellent remarks. So I'm very pleased now to introduce Samayya Afzal from the Labour Muslim Network.
Thank you so much. During last year's conference, I happened to be in the vicinity of a really, really horrifying conversation. Two people, an MP and their staff member, and I should reiterate, obviously, at Labour Party conference, Labour MP, were watching a video of a delegate that was speaking on conference floor about the death toll of Palestinians in the first few days after Israel's offensive in Gaza, so straight after October the 7th. The staff member was laughing very loudly as they were watching that delegate's words. It was so loud that it caught my attention. The person in the video was talking about the lack of attention, the lack of sympathy for Palestinian victims, and the lack of that they receive in the media. And he commented, there's a reason why their lives aren't considered worthy of sympathy. That staff member laughed again, and said, they keep talking about these abstract things, these hypothetical theories of racism. They then started recommending that the MP needs to start saying that even mentioning Palestinian lives is diminishing Israeli lives, and that Palestinian death is only invoked to diminish Israeli death. This is the conference that we attended last year, where a Muslim MP had to flee for her own security, where I, as a visibly Muslim woman, was treated to the inner Islamophobic workings of an elected member's office, and where anyone remotely horrified by Israel's attack on a tiny strip of blockaded land so densely populated by civilians was completely shunned. I was there at the Medical Aid for Palestinians reception last year. I saw how it was avoided by so many of the MPs and shadow cabinet members that we elected, that we supported. So I want to thank the Palestinian Solidarity Campaign, not just for putting this issue on the conference agenda this year, but all of the incredible work that's been done over the last year to move the dial in our political system from that horrifying moment and those moments directly after October 7th. Whether that's national protest attended by millions, whether that's lobby days in Parliament so MPs can answer their constituents as they ask them how their party or how they as their MP are responding to the genocide in Gaza. And we will use those terms. We will talk about genocide, because it's not just me and you. It's not just human rights organizations. It's not just nations like South Africa that are flying the flag for Palestinian human rights and justice. It's the legal assessment of the highest international court, the International Court of Justice, which has found Israel with a case to answer on the genocide of Palestinians, and ruled in an advisory opinion that there is a system of racial discrimination against Palestinians. Whether you like it or not, whether you believe it or not, it exists and it's true. That racial discrimination has a name. It's virulently anti-Palestinian. It's virulently Islamophobic in nature, and both, as Liz mentioned, feed off each other. We know that Islamophobia, for example, isn't limited to slurs, attacks, being othered in political debates. It continues to be the only way that we reckon with it as a society, which is completely and utterly wrong. It's what allows politicians to stand up and denounce Islamophobia, the Islamophobia we've seen in the last year, for example. It allows them to stand up and denounce it while knowing that it's their words, their policies, their actions that inspired it in the first place. This bogeyman of the extreme, angry, volatile, suspicious, vulnerable to violence, anti-democratic Muslim that has been used in our political debates for so long. It underpins prevent. It forces Muslims into the position of subjects as opposed to citizens, and it allows our rights in this country to be violated. It's what gives people the confidence to openly say on the front page of newspapers, on BBC News, on every single channel available to them, and they have many channels available to them to peddle the far-right narrative, that there are Islamists now in charge of Britain, that the streets of Britain are dominated by Islamist extremists, and that there are no-go areas that Muslims control. But the consequences that are unfolding quite literally in front of our eyes, live-streamed, videoed, tweeted, written about in thousands and thousands of words, and will continue to be written about in thousands and thousands of words. The worst consequence of anti-Palestinian Islamophobic racism, it's not being attacked as we sit here. It's not the curtailment of our freedom to protest, to speak out. It might not even be those who are at risk of deportation for their views. Although these are all terrible, terrible consequences, the worst and the most horrific consequence of all is the forcibly silenced, the forcibly nameless, the forcibly faceless tens of thousands of Palestinians who are being slaughtered in front of our eyes, and we're being told that we're powerless to stop it. We're told to hold back on naming it, identifying it, until it meets the threshold of political opinion, as though they decide what truths we're allowed to adopt, as though that's ever worked in the past, and as though we're going to remain silent. We won't, and history will judge them accordingly. Every historian that denies the Nakba, the ongoing Nakba, the current Nakba, the one that never ended, every journalist that infers that Palestinians are acceptable collateral damage in military targets and operations, every politician that believes the fight for self-determination, liberation, freedom of the Palestinian people is a terrorist endeavor, every opinion former that designates all Palestinians as Hamas concludes that they live unworthy lives and die unworthy deaths. Everyone that considers Palestinians primitive argues that it's the right of a more militarily advanced, freedom-loving country, Israel, to occupy, detain, and kill Palestinians to uphold itself. Every single one of those will be judged. And it's our job, the Labour Muslim Network, to make sure that that judgment is followed by accountability.
Thank you very much, Samayya, for another excellent contribution. Okay, thank you. So as I mentioned, our next speaker, unfortunately, can't be with us in person, but fortunately, in 2024, can join us via Zoom. So I'd like to welcome Taj Ali, who's a journalist and historian.
Thank you so much to the Palestine Solidarity Campaign for organising this event, and the speakers who have already spoken quite eloquently about the links between Islamophobia and our support for the Palestinian cause. And it's important to recognise that the racist riots that we saw last month did not come out of a vacuum. Islamophobia never occurs in a vacuum. It is emboldened and it is enabled by rhetoric from the top. And what we saw in November last year was a 600% increase in Islamophobic hate crime. And the reason we saw this increase in Islamophobic hate crime is because we had politicians linking support for the Palestinian cause with extremism, right? We saw a massive protest movement in support of Palestine, and we had the Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, describing people as hate marchers. Then we had Lee Anderson making derogatory remarks about Sadiq Khan. Then we have Nigel Farage talking about how British Muslims don't share British values. And at the same time, when Labour politicians are being held to account for refusing to vote for a ceasefire, we are being accused of intimidation and abuse. So all of this led up to that moment. There was an atmosphere of hate being cultivated. And it's important to recognize that Islamophobia often functions as a political tool. It has to be understood in the context of the post 9/11 security state apparatus, where you had politicians justifying draconian authoritarian measures and foreign policy decisions on the basis that in Britain we face an Islamist threat. And British Muslims were the collateral damage, whether it was the Prevent agenda, whether it was the Iraq war, whether it was, clamping down on our civil liberties. They needed something to blame. They needed a people to blame. And so that's why it's important to understand how Palestine solidarity links to what we've seen in the previous month. It's very easy for politicians to say this is a far-right problem, this is social media misinformation, but actually much of the racism has been mainstreamed. We've heard it in subtle language for many, many years now. And it's allowed the racist thugs to feel comfortable saying what they want to say. They felt emboldened to say what they want to say. And I have to say, last month, if you were to speak to British Muslims, there was absolute fear in our communities. We knew of Muslim women who were having panic attacks. We knew of people who refused to go into work because they were terrified. And this is where Islamophobia and racism and hatred leads. And it's very interesting how quickly we've moved on from the events of last month, as if it's all gone away, as if the hateful atmosphere has just disappeared overnight, even though we know that Islamophobic incidents are still occurring, often isolated attacks on hijab-wearing Muslim women who disproportionately suffer the impact of Islamophobia. And so it's important, people are talking about prosecution of the people involved in the rioting, but we have to tackle the fundamental issue, which is that for many, many years now, we have had an atmosphere of hate peddled by politicians. Now, I think it's very, very important that the Labour movement has a role to play here. And that is twofold. Number one, I think it's important that we are organising in the communities where we've seen rioting. Many of these areas don't have large Muslim communities or Black and Asian communities, but they were the places that were targeted in the northeast, in Merseyside, in parts of Belfast. And many of these places once had thriving industries. They had a very strong trade union movement. They had labour clubs, and all of that apparatus disappeared. And it's the far right who have really tried to develop some support in these places. And so I think we need an alternative. When we look at the decisions that Labour's made on the winter fuel payments, or the latest scandals around freebies and sleaze and all the rest of it, it's the Reform Party that are picking up support. And that's very, very dangerous, because what it means is in a few years' time, if Reform are doing very, very well in the polls, Labour would be more inclined to listen to them on all sorts of issues of the day. And I think one of the most effective rebellions that we saw in the Parliamentary Labour Party was on the ceasefire vote. The Palestine Solidarity Campaign had a very effective e-tool. Our communities rallied around it and encouraged our elected members of parliament to vote for a ceasefire. And it's that kind of pressure within our communities that can really shift politicians. And so I think there is a tendency and there is a complacency from some politicians in the Labour Party to think that all of this is going to go away, that they may be likely to win back those seats that they lost to independents, that seats that have now become marginals in places like Bradford and Birmingham and Ilford and Slough are suddenly going to be easy to win back. They won't be. And I think we have leverage power here. The Labour movement, the Palestine Solidarity Campaign, we have leverage. We can shift politicians who are on the fence on these issues. And that's why I think it's really, really important that we do build that campaign around ending all arms sales to Israel. There are some members of parliament who are hesitant to demonstrate their support for the Palestine Solidarity Campaign. There are some who often make statements, but when it comes to signing early day motions or voting in the House of Commons on an issue, they'd rather choose to abstain. And we need to make clear to them that that is not an option, that you have to stand up for Palestine, because Palestine is a red line the same way as fighting for a decent pay rise for workers, the same way as fighting for pensioners and kids growing up in poverty. We have to make Palestine as important as those other domestic issues. And I think we all have a role to play in that, in constituency Labour parties, in affiliated trade unions. We need to be able to put pressure on politicians, and they do listen. If you were to speak to a member of parliament, they would tell you that it was on the ceasefire vote that many of them had the most emails they've ever had. And that's an example of a very effective campaign where pressure is being placed both in parliament and outside of parliament. So I think it's really important to recognize that. I've just come back from Bosnia, and quite honestly, speaking to genocide survivors and going into the museums and talking to people, the parallels between what's happening in Gaza right now and what happened in Bosnia back then are striking. And everywhere you go in Bosnia, you see Palestine flags, you see supporters of the Palestinian cause. And so this is about more than just electoralism and shifting the dial with politicians. This is about trying to prevent people dying in Gaza. Labour are now in government. Before they used to say, well, we're not in government, we're in opposition, we can't really do anything. We need to put pressure on them to shift their position on the arms sales, because 10% is simply not good enough. It's really and truly shameful that to this day, they still haven't refused to cut all the arms sales to Israel. And so I think it's really, really important that we use every tool at our disposal to push them on this issue. And again, our communities do have the power to shift them. And so what I would say to Labour members is it's really, really important that you're working outside Labour Party structures as well, because there are many people who have now left the Labour Party over their position on Gaza. There are many people who stood against the party. There are independent candidates, but people are still around. Just because you've lost faith in political parties and politicians doesn't mean you're no longer political. And so I think it's really important to build a broad coalition, that there may be disagreements on the tactics. Some people may choose to stay in the party and to move the dial. And I think we have to commend people like Samayya in the Labour Muslim Network, MPs like Zara Sultana, MPs like Richard Bergen and Imran Hussain, who are doing important work in Parliament on this very issue. But those of us who live in communities where our MPs are not attending these briefings, they're not voting the right way, they're not standing up for the Palestinian cause, we need to make sure we're putting pressure on them. I think, thinking back to the riots of last month, Tommy Robinson wanted a mass presence on the streets because he saw the power of the Palestine Solidarity Campaign. He saw 800,000 people from a variety of different backgrounds standing up for justice in Palestine. And that's the power of our movement. And so I think we need to continue to support these demonstrations. It's unfortunate that slowly the numbers start to decline. So we need to keep the pressure on in and outside Parliament. And we need to connect the struggles. It's precisely because we are anti-racist that we stand with the Palestinian people, because apartheid, the racist system of apartheid, the genocide of the Palestinian people, and the dehumanization of them to justify their killings is racism. And so racism, fighting racism, is about standing up for the Palestinian people and taking a stand against Islamophobia and anti-Semitism and all forms of racism here. So we have to connect what's happening here in this country with what is happening abroad, and we have to continue putting the pressure on our politicians.
So our final speaker before I open it up is, of course, Ben Jamal, the Director of the Palestine Solidarity Campaign.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Just before I go to what I'd intended to say, there's just a reflection I want to share with you that was sort of inspired and motivated by something Samayya said when she took us back to her experiences, but I think very common experiences for anybody who was at this conference a year ago. We held our fringe meeting that year on, I think, October the 9th, and it was in the room adjacent to this one. It was a packed room. It was filled, in particular, with the representatives of every mainstream press outlet, broadcaster in the country, who sat there, mobile phones, notepads at the ready to report on anything that could be understood or framed as barbarous, as supportive of terrorism, as anti-Semitic. And as we sat in that room, as I recall, number 10 Downing Street, the Foreign Office, and the office of the Mayor of London, City Hall, were all emblazoned with the flag of Israel. The day before we'd met, Israeli leaders had already begun to broadcast statements of genocidal intent. Yoav Gallant had already said, we are going to cut off food, fuel, medical supplies, water to everybody in Gaza because we are not dealing with human beings, we are dealing with inhuman animals. And Benjamin Netanyahu had told every Palestinian in Gaza to exit because we are going to target every area of the Gaza Strip. We are going to turn it into a deserted island. And we were here in that room trying to assert the reality that the campaign for justice for the Palestinian people is rooted in, is integral to the broader anti-racist struggle. And we come back again this year, and in this meeting, and in our meeting this evening, to reassert those fundamental realities. If there's a underpinning theme of this meeting, then for me, it's the question of, well, what does it mean to show a consistent anti-racism? I want to address, and I'm not going to apologise, because I'm going to echo some of the things you've heard, in particular some of the things that Liz said. I want to address, though, in particular, what does that mean in relation to the rights of the Palestinian people? And what does it mean in terms of the responsibilities of the Labour Party in that regard, and now, of course, of a Labour government, and how its failures to meet those responsibilities are part of this broader failure to own and implement a consistent anti-racist politics. And I want to particular maybe add some thoughts to what Liz has already outlined by describing or outlining what I would describe as a normalization of anti-Palestinian racism across the political establishment, which is long-standing but has been significantly ramped up in the aftermath of October the 7th, and how that's particularly manifested itself within this Labour Party and within the Labour leadership. Now, this process of normalising anti-Palestinian racism is a function of something, and I hope Liz will forgive me for this, but I want to reference an article she wrote some time ago. And if you haven't read it, I would urge you to do so. It's an article entitled Fault Lines in the Fight Against Racism and Anti-Semitism. And part of what Liz addresses in that article is what she describes as the erasure of internationally focused anti-racist traditions, manifested historically, for example, in the fight against South African apartheid, in the broader anti-colonial struggle, in the fight for US civil rights. And these have been erased by a reframing of racism to focus on individual bias or prejudice rather than structural and institutionalized racism that create the conditions for the dispossession, disadvantaging, and marginalization of whole groups or classes. Now, the Palestinian struggle for liberation is an integral part of this broader anti-racist, anti-colonial struggle. Right now, Palestinians are facing the darkest moment in that enduring struggle, resisting what the world's highest court has accepted as a plausible case of genocide. But as you all know, this is a genocide built on the foundations of a decades-long oppression, of a system of colonization, ethnic cleansing, and apartheid imposed upon all of the Palestinian people. In the words of B'Tselem, Israel's leading human rights monitoring body, Israel is a state organized on one principle, advancing the supremacy of one group, Jewish Israelis, over another, Palestinians. So when I talk about a normalization of anti-Palestinian racism, in the first place, I'm talking about the normalization of this system of oppression, rooted in a straightforward denial or ignoring of the realities of its structures, reframing a racial system of injustice as a conflict, or worse, as a battle by a democratic state to defend itself against barbaric hordes who wish to destroy it, along with all of Western civilization. So Palestinians asserting their rights, including the right to defend themselves against oppression, become inherently terrorists motivated by a hatred of the Jewish people. Now, as Liz has said, a key element in achieving this reframing and thereby normalizing anti-Palestinian racist structures of oppression is the conflation of the Palestinian struggle for rights and support for that struggle, advocacy for Palestinian rights, conflating that with anti-Semitism. This long-standing narrative and process has been formalized in the last 10 years through a definition of anti-Semitism. Liz touched on this, the RHRA definition, which shifts the lens of what it means to be anti-Semitic onto discourse about Palestinian rights and advocacy for their realization, including, for example, support for the Palestinian call for boycott, divestment and sanctions. Now, one prominent recent example of this conflation in action centres on the narratives that have been employed about the use of the slogan, "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free." It's a slogan widely used across the movement, which speaks to the reality of the nature of Israel's denial of the rights of the Palestinian people and the parameters of Palestinian liberations. Palestinians will be free when the structures of apartheid are finally dismantled. For Palestinians living in exile, this means they will be able to return. For Palestinians living under military occupation, this means that that occupation will be ended. And for Palestinians living as citizens of the State of Israel, they will no longer live as second-class citizens subject to a vast body of laws that discriminate against them and disadvantage them. Using the framework of this new understanding of anti-Semitism, however, this slogan has been reframed as simply a genocidal call for the destruction of the Jewish people. Some of you may have seen the video where I was asked about this when I gave evidence to the Home Affairs Select Committee, who were investigating the policing of the marches that we have been organising since October. And I gave the explanation for the slogan that I've just given to you. And I added that what those who deny this are essentially saying is that no matter how many times Palestinians say what they mean by the slogan, well, we know that they mean something else. This is a form of racism which rests on the assumption that Palestinians are not to be trusted and must have barbaric intentions. Now, ironically, I don't know if it's the right use, ironically, but ironically, when I was saying this, I was interrupted by the chair, who asked me to stop talking, stating, well, you might say that, Mr. Jamal, but other people think quite differently. She was, by the way, Diana Johnson, who was then the vice chair of his Labour Friends of Israel and is now the policing minister. So what we see here is a twofold process. The process that Liz referred to in her article of a bifurcating of racism, a shift from a focus on structural racism to individual bigotry and prejudice, and then alongside that, the creation of a hierarchy of racism. This is what underpins Labour Party's trumpeting of the importance of tackling anti-Semitism alongside, comfortably, a complicity with normalising anti-Palestinian racism and Israel's structure of oppression and a tolerance of Islamophobia. We saw this at play in the Labour Party's response to the anti-boycott bill, when the previous government tried to ban public bodies from making ethical choices about spending or investment. Labour did oppose the bill, in the end at least. Initially, it abstained, but it only did oppose the bill, and members of the front bench made this very clear at the time, because of the potential impact the bill would have on people such as the Uyghurs or Ukrainians, who they deemed to be deserving of support and human rights. What was repeatedly stated by party leaders was that had the law succeeded in singling out Palestinians and preventing them and them alone amongst oppressed people around the world from appealing to people in this country for support and solidarity, had it explicitly treated Palestinians differently to everyone else, then the Labour Party would have supported it. So in doing so, they endorsed the narrative that calling for boycott and divestment against companies complicit in Israel's oppression of the Palestinian people was somehow anti-Semitic, or at best risked fomenting anti-Semitism. We see the same process in play right now when the party refused to advertise the fringe we are holding this evening under its correct title. You can read it on the leaflet. Justice for Palestine, Confronting Genocide and Ending Apartheid. The party removed the references to genocide and apartheid from the title of the meeting in the official Fringe Guide. Our answer to that is you cannot have a commitment to tackling an injustice unless you are prepared and able to correctly name that injustice. And we also see the same process in the endorsement and promulgation by Labour leaders of some of the narratives demonising those advocating for Palestinian rights, both in relation to what Peter referenced, those previously loyal voters who turned away from the party at the recent general election. You have all heard the narratives of what those campaigns were about, scenes of violent intimidation, and the narratives about those who have been marching in solidarity with the Palestinian people in the marches of unprecedented size that we have been organising over the past 11 months. So these processes of normalising anti-Palestinian racism, I would say in conclusion, are dangerous in three ways. Firstly, by undermining efforts to hold Israel to account and therefore supporting its ability to sustain its system of racist oppression. Secondly, they undermine a coherent anti-racism by suggesting that one can be anti-racist but not opposed to the most egregious form of institutionalized racism that exists, that of apartheid. And thirdly, they normalize the narratives that have been at the heart of the rise of the far right. A key racist trope driving the far right riots this summer has been the need to reclaim the streets from the hate marches, the Islamists, the terrorist sympathizers, meaning those marching in solidarity with the Palestinian people. Labour's failure to address the Islamophobic and the anti-Palestinian racist nature of these riots, instead treating them solely as criminal acts, was underpinned by its own failures to tackle racism consistently, tackle its own Islamophobia, and to recognise and challenge Israel's system of apartheid. A Labour Party and a Labour government truly committed to anti-racism will take Islamophobia seriously and tackle its root causes. A Labour Party and a Labour government committed to anti-racism sincerely will confront the reality of the genocide Israel is currently unleashing, live up to its responsibilities as identified by the ICJ not to aid and abet that genocide, and end all complicity with the decades-old system of racist oppression upon which this genocide is founded. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Ben, for that.